Let's talk about Frederick Douglass, one of the greatest and sort of most paradigmatic American lives or life stories. Um, Partly because, or largely because, he told his own life story, so well himself, classically, um, in 3 different autobiographies. But we're not doing his autobiographies. Uh, we're doing an address he gave at Case Western or Western Reserve University in Cleveland in 1854, called "The Claims of the Negro, Ethnologically Considered." Um, and I think in some ways Douglass, because of the overwhelming influence of his autobiographies and his compelling persona, maybe his work as a thinker or an intellectual is somewhat underrated. Um, Although people are always digging through the amazingly elaborate corpus of Douglass's writings, and it's quite various and quite astonishingly excellent. Famous speaker as well. Um, he was an enslaved person. I mean, I'm maybe you're familiar with the outlines of the story. I'm not going to do any elaborate justice to it. Enslaved on the eastern shore of Maryland, escaped to Philadelphia and then to New York City as a young man. Uh, Learned to read, famously. That's actually central to the autobiographies, um, in various ways, maybe by his master's wife at a certain point when he was a child, um, and then repressed for being literate or trying to become literate, and also for teaching his fellow enslaved people to read. Um, Became active in abolitionist circles. He was an ally of Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison, who we've read briefly, the Peace Society Manifesto. And although they split later on, we could talk about the complexities of the abolitionist movement. Um, and edited a newspaper for decades, really, under one title or another. Most famously, the North Star from Rochester. Okay. And I think one thing I want to emphasize is a kind of heritage of African American thought. Among other things, a radical critique of American culture. And multiply philosophically interesting in different dimensions, different figures, if you ask me. And I think in some ways I'd make Frederick Douglass like just very central to this story. So we read David Walker's Appeal, a good part of it anyway, and you'll find passages even in this piece by Douglass that echo. If you look at the last couple pages where he comes way off of this scholarly mode that he's on, and he starts sort of talking about God's vengeance for the crime of slavery. He sounds quite like David Walker, actually. I'm sure he knew the appeal, which was 20 years before this, something like that, 25 years before this particular piece. So David Walker, and I think that if you read, as you read this speech, uh, he actually is, it's the same genre as Emerson, basically, the lecture. Uh, but you'll, well, I don't know how familiar you are, for example, with W.E.B. DuBois, but there are many themes and even like sort of almost turns of phrase that anticipate famous observations of DuBois. Um, okay, so I mean, just like an example would be, just I think even the rhetorical style, but also the basic ideas, or some of the basic ideas run through a lot of, a couple hundred years of history. So this is on page 5. Gentlemen, in selecting the claims of the Negro as the subject of my remarks today, I am animated by a desire to bring before you a matter of living importance, matter upon which action as well as thought is required. He's talking to scholars. I'm going to set this up a little bit in a minute. Okay, and he's telling them, just thinking about this isn't enough. You got to try to do something about this situation. The relation subsisting between the white and black people of this country is the vital question of the age. Like, for example, DuBois says the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. He has very similar declarations to that. And, he's trying to say, like, you got to be on one side or the other. And he says right there on page 6, he that is not for us is against us. All right. Which was actually like a kind of a slogan of the Black Power movement. And if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Okay, so I don't know. There's, but I'll try to show some more echoes. And to Marcus Garvey, I did not put Marcus Garvey down here, but I think there's you'll hear themes that came to be important in the Marcus Garvey movement. We're not really going to read Garvey either, but Lord knows we should. Very interesting historical events, and also a very interesting thinker and writer. Okay, now it's 1854, 6 years before the Civil War, and Frederick Douglass is giving a commencement address to the literary societies at this university, at this college, okay? He himself believes that nothing like that has ever happened before in America. So this is not a very read thing, although it's not completely unknown at all. But that's an extraordinary occasion, okay? And it's not like Frederick Douglass has a bunch of college degrees, right? He taught himself, and he and his fellows taught each other to read on a plantation on the Eastern Shore and on the streets of Baltimore. Right. And he's speaking to people, with PhDs and professors and stuff like this. He pretends to be a little scared about this, or like think like, what am I doing here? But I think actually, all things considered, he's extremely confident in this context. And his presence in this context is transgressive. It was an incredible kind of progressive gesture, I'm sure, for them to invite him. It's maybe 10 years before this or 15 years before this that Oberlin College, also in Ohio, became the first college, I think, in the U.S. to admit black students, and women too, maybe later, actually, a year or two later. There are precious few colleges in the whole nation that will admit black students. Only a couple probably at this time. All right. Probably the first historically black college was founded this same year, 1854. Depends on what you count as a college, but Lincoln University near Wilmington, Delaware, between Lancaster and Wilmington. But anyway, like even the presence of a black person in the context of higher education is transgressive at this moment, much less giving a commencement address, all right, like a sort of a position of a certain kind of authority. So that's extraordinary in itself. Okay, now, the first thing he does, because he's talking to ethnographers, or I'm not sure exactly how he's defining it, like what we might call anthropologists. And he's addressing the anthropological literature. okay, so first of all, he presents himself in a scholarly vein. He keeps saying he's no scholar. He keeps quoting the edge of racial science and stuff, you know, the current literature. So he's actually engaged in a scholarly excursus. Right? Again, I mean, that in itself is an enactment of his uh, assertion of the equality of black people, right? Intellectual equality. He's enacting it as he argues for it, and doing both in a very compelling way. Like, he's a master rhetorician, this guy, all right, and quite a good arguer as well. But he's in this position where the first thing he thinks he has to establish is that black people are human beings. So he quotes a series of texts, including just a newspaper piece from the Richmond newspaper, saying otherwise. All right. So, do we belong to the same species? And the first series of arguments is actually directed at the then current debate about whether humanity had a common ancestor or actually consisted of several different species. What he says is like, he actually says, I find this too outrageous to have to respond to. All I want to do is ridicule it. And in ridiculing it, I would show it to be false, because, a parrot or a monkey isn't going to hit you with ridicule for your self-serving bullshit. Okay. But he does have arguments, but they're also just beautiful kind of rhetorical constructions. Stuff like this on page 8. Man is distinguished from all other animals by the possession of certain definite faculties and powers, as well as by physical organization and proportions. He's the only two-handed animal on the earth, the only one that laughs, and nearly the only one that weeps. Men instinctively distinguish between men and brutes, animals that is. Common sense itself is scarcely needed to detect the absence of manhood in a monkey, or to recognize its presence in a Negro. His speech, his reason, his power to acquire and retain knowledge, his heaven-erected face, his habitudes, his hopes, his fears, his aspirations, his prophecies, plant between him and the brute creation a distinction as eternal as it is palpable. And I didn't maybe do justice as I read that, but I would compare the writing to Emerson and Thoreau, like, for its in some ways it's better because it's got its feet on the ground. It's got a kind of clarity that sometimes escape both Emerson and Thoreau. Okay. I'll leave you, and maybe we can discuss this in class on Tuesday on Zoom, to look at those arguments. But I want to emphasize a couple themes that do, I think, run through this history of African American thought in various ways. All right. So one of the central ideas that, 1854, this is after Darwin's Origin of the Species, but I don't think he shows any particular awareness of the theory of evolution. And he's still got a sort of semi-theological structure in the background, which is probably in common with his audience as well at this point in Ohio. He's arguing that we're all created in God's image, partly, but then it's partly an ethnological and even biological style argument, engaging the scholarship. Okay, so what does account for the difference between the races? If it's not that we are different species or whatever. I mean, actually, Douglass might be sort of a skeptic about the existence of races at all, whether they make any sense. Certainly not if they're biologically defined, I think. He thinks of, differences in skin tone, sort of overall average differences in facial features or body types, things like this, as very likely the result of environmental factors. Believe it or not, this was not a widely popular view at the time about racial differences. He's arguing against the whole of like European human science at this time, which regards race. This is the golden age of race science, that regards race as fundamental realities. Right? He's arguing that, first of all, environmental differences can account for a lot of physical differences, or even all of them. Argues that elaborately, with all kinds of examples about, like, if I've seen flinty New Englanders settle in southern Indiana and turn into, blobby bubbas or whatever in a couple of generations. Like, you can see the environmental effects. And then also, though, the races are socially constructed in imagination as like a series of stereotypes, but also constructed in reality by procedures of oppression. So you outlaw literacy among Black people and enforce that brutally, and then you point to the ignorance of Black people as evidence of a natural biological difference and a justification for oppression. Right? You actually create the conditions that justify, that you purport justify, your racist oppression or an exploitation or slavery. But you're producing those conditions, not detecting them. You're not discovering them. You're creating them. So I'll just try a couple of things along these lines, or just one passage maybe. He says, he's talking about Southern pretenders to science. This is on page 15. Pride and selfishness, combined with mental power, never want for a theory to justify them. Now, he's talking about race science as maybe put forward by various European figures and bought and used by the Southern plantocracy, slavocracy, to justify slavery. One thing he's just pointing out is, like, that's an incredibly self-serving view, right? Like, well, we are the master race kind of view, right? Like, it's just like patting us on the back, patting each other on the back. And one should be suspicious about that. When people putting forward scientific positions that beef up their own self-esteem, I would really check carefully on the research in that case, and there's a shitload of that. Pride and selfishness combined with mental power, like in a scholar or scientist, never want for a theory to justify them. Pride and selfishness. And when men oppress their fellow men, the oppressor ever finds in the character of the oppressed a full justification for his oppression. You justify your oppression of others by their supposed intrinsic character. And you're defending this scientifically. It's like the worst hooey in the world, man. The claim to objectivity, or the claim that these things are natural and you've discovered them. It's just kind of the worst sort of self-delusion. You've lost track of what you're doing completely, that you're pursuing your own interests and congratulating yourself. Ignorance and depravity, and the inability to rise from degradation to civilization and respectability are the most usual allegations against the oppressed. Ignorance and depravity, violence and animality as well. The evils most fostered by slavery and oppression are precisely those which slaveholders and oppressors would transfer from their system to the inherent character of their victims. The conditions imposed by slavery are then used as discoveries to justify slavery. You degrade, humiliate, beat, break, traumatize people. And then you look at their degraded condition and say, like, well, this is a natural difference between us, but it's one we've manufactured, actually. I mean, that's a pretty sophisticated take on race. And I think if you move around in Douglass, you'll find more along those lines. And there's somewhat more in here on that. And I mean, there's a lot to say for it. Another theme, this is the environmental social account of race. And I guess I also listed it as a central theme here. I don't know if you can see this in this light. Assertion of the common ancestry of all people. That's a central theme in the first half of this piece. And then he kind of broaches, it might be almost puzzling how much he emphasizes Egypt in this thing. But this is something, I mean, it's maybe already bopping around a little bit in African American thought in 1854. There's hints of it in Walker, for example, and some of the earlier slave narratives. Aliotto Equiano, for example, I think. This idea first, like sort of reclaiming Egypt as part of the history of Africa. And this is a way to, just say like, no, we Africans and people of African ancestry, we stand at the origin of European civilization, because this is also part of the narrative, the influence of Egypt on Greece and Rome, let's say. And actually, the influence of Egypt on Greece cannot be denied, really. You'll run through all kinds of stuff in Plato, run into all kinds of stuff in Plato about Egypt and stuff, for instance. The high and the most ancient, perhaps, or maybe as they understood that, at least in 1850, Western civilization. So he has, first of all, a long argument that Egyptians historically were black people, were Negroes in his parlance, or in the parlance of that time, 1850, that is. And he wants to, so part of that's just, okay, so it's also an attempt to create a narrative, a proud historical narrative. There's all kinds of other ways to work into the centrality of Africa. And for example, when you get to Marcus Garvey, he's more concerned about Ethiopia or Abyssinia, which ain't that far from Egypt, but is a biblical land as well. And with a glorious history of emperors and stuff like this, and a high civilization for millennia. And a way to say, like, Garvey constantly, in the 20th century, early 20th century, constantly hinted at a return to Africa. And that was in the air too in 1850. We can talk about that maybe, the colonization movement that Garrison and Douglass opposed vociferously, actually. Lincoln endorsed it, though. But in terms of, Douglass is not suggesting repatriation. He argues elaborately that African Americans are Americans, like generations long. Okay, we're not Africans anymore, he says. So he doesn't suggest repatriation. What he does suggest is a glorious history of high civilizations in Africa from which these supposedly inferior people are descended. Okay. And in a way, he wants to re-narrate the history of the world to emphasize what we might call people of color, okay? Or just to acknowledge the actual role. At one point, he says 4/5 of the world is non-white, okay? So now let's actually do some history of the world. And for one thing, where does white civilization come from? It comes out of Africa, perhaps. Right? And it also hints that there might be a glorious destiny on the other end, a reassertion of the greatness of, say, African civilizations, maybe through the diaspora as well, and using that as an element of identity and pride. And I just say, like, this was revived in the 80s in a very kind of systematic and scholarly way by people like Molefi Kete Asante, who's a professor or was professor at Temple. You know, specifically talking about, like, for example, the Egyptian influence on the Greeks and re-narrating the history of civilization to centralize the non-white elements. Okay. All right. So on Tuesday on Zoom, I'd like to discuss this for a while, and then we'll talk about this interview, this extraordinary interview with Sitting Bull from the 1880s. Really quite some document, actually. So read that.